Welcome to this month's Café CSE lecture series. This is a series that we hold every third Wednesday of the month, sponsored by the European Studies program. The idea is to get together and to think about pressing issues in Europe, some of them historical, a lot of them current, usually trying to cross as many disciplinary boundaries as we can. Just a couple of quick announcements of upcoming Café CSE sessions. So next month on February 17th, we're going way into the past. Topic is Exhuming Ancient Europe, Translation, Archaeology, Papyrology. Kim Johnson, who's translated Virgil, will be here from the English department. Cindy Finlayson, who's done archaeological digs, still to this day does archaeological digs in Greco-Roman ruins. And Roger McFarlane and Hieronymo DeSimone will be talking about their work on some of the remaining kind of charred scrolls from Pompeii that they do interesting work on. And then our final Café CSE of the year will be March 16th. We thought we would send you all out on a exciting note. We're calling this one the Top 10 Underrated European Destinations, where we're having three professors with healthy travel accounts share their stories of where they've been. So the basic idea of this series is kind of, let's imagine a little bit. So you just happen to wander into a cafe in Paris or in Vienna, and it's the only cafe anywhere in Europe in which there happen to be four Mormons gathered together, three of whom are intellectuals and one of whom is kind of peppering them with questions, and that's my role today. And for about 35, 40 minutes, you listen in. You kind of enjoy the discussion, but finally you just can't hold back anymore, and you burst forward to the microphone, and you interject your preferably a courteous, thoughtful question into the mix. Eventually, after 10 or 15 minutes of back and forth, we've all kind of come together, and we go arm in arm singing the Internationale, or maybe in this case called to serve, out into another eating establishment known as the foyer, in which we all share, today I think it's crackers, cheese, and cream puffs as a united group. So that's what we're doing here today. My role, I'm Nick Mason, I'm the coordinator of the European Studies program here. My role here is truly as the resident know-nothing. I was a Mormon missionary who got called to the exotic European location of Roanoke, Virginia, in contrast to my three much more privileged missionary friends here on the stand. Let me introduce them quickly. So Cindy Brewer in the middle. Cindy is an associate professor of German. Cindy works on 18th and 19th century women's literature in German-speaking countries. She's got a great project she does also on particularly women missionaries from Germany into the outer mission, into kind of the far-flung regions of the world, and she'll talk a little bit about that today. She served a mission herself, a Mormon mission in Vienna, Austria in the 1980s. Eric Dursteler is a professor of history. Eric works mainly on the Mediterranean world, kind of reconceiving the way we think of geography. He's got a really important book about to come out next month called The Mediterranean World, From the Fall of Rome to the Rise of Napoleon. He's also, another forthcoming title of his that's even more directly related to what we're doing today is that he, Jim Toronto, and Mike Homer have just finished a book called Mormons in the Piazza, the history of the Latter-day Saints in Italy, in which they trace it from Lorenzo Snow's early missions up through today, and the dedication of the Rome Temple here in this year, next year.
It's not entirely clear.
Whenever they get approval. Maybe the ambassador can help us with that. Different country, different side of the Adriatic. In fact, I ought to acknowledge you. We've got we've several special guests today, but we're really honored to have Ambassador Paro, the U.S. ambassador, the ambassador to the U.S. from Croatia. He's on campus today. Who's joining us. And in fact, on the missionary note, earlier today, he talked about probably the single greatest Mormon missionary in the history of Croatia. In fact, by far the greatest was someone who was not technically a missionary there. It was Krasimir Kosic, the great basketball player, still to this day, you mentioned to me earlier, still to this day thought of the greatest Yugoslavian basketball player ever. Came to BYU, played, joined the church, went back home, and is still kind of the central Mormon figure there. So it's kind of a different narrative of missionary work in ways. But we're honored to have you here. Eric served a mission in Italy, in Milan, in the 1980s. And then our final speaker today is Craig Harline. Craig is also a professor of history. Craig works on religious history in the European context from early modern period all the way up through today. He's published widely on the topic. His two most recent books are right in line with what we're talking about today. The one is titled Conversions, Two Family Stories from the Reformation in Modern America. And then a memoir that he published last year about his own mission experiences in Belgium in the 1970s, titled Way Below the Angels. The pretty clearly troubled, but not even close to tragic confessions of a real live Mormon missionary. So it's an honor to be on up here with the three of you. So we've decided we're going to try to stick roughly to about half in kind of the historical narrative of missionary work, both Mormon and non-Mormon in Europe. And then we'll try to pivot around the midway point to think about the context for missionary work there, again, Mormon and non-Mormon, from the time they served in the 70s and 80s up through the present moment, what's happening there today and what trends we're seeing there today. So we want to start kind of in the deep past here, and this is kind of an area where all three of them have some expertise, but Craig in particular. So let's maybe think in terms of three moments. Let's bracket it up to pre-1837, which is kind of the moment in which the first Mormon missionaries arrive in Europe. And then we'll kind of have a chunk 1837 up until the 1960s or so. And then we'll think about the 1970s forward. So Craig, let me start with you. So if we were to go back to Europe, say we land in Zurich, or we land in Zagreb, or we land in Amsterdam in the year 1550 or so, would we encounter what we would recognize as missionaries anywhere?
You would in some places, certainly in Amsterdam. Amsterdam was not officially, but the public religion was the Reformed religion, which is Protestant. And there were a lot of Jesuit missionaries there trying to convert people, and Jesuits were Catholic, of course. And that was a development of the Reformation. There hadn't been missionaries in Europe since the ancient world, really. Europe was Christianized around 800, mostly by missionaries who came from Italy and Ireland. 1200 for Scandinavia. Some people think Scandinavia still has never been Christianized. But anyway, that's another issue. But there really was no chance for missionary work after that, after about 1200 in Scandinavia, until the Reformation. So when the Reformation happened, the possibility of converting to another religion was a reality. It hadn't been that way since the ancient world, really, with Christians in the Roman Empire, starting with Paul.
So let's fast forward maybe to 1700 or so, 1600, 1700. Is it legal in Catholic France for Protestant missionaries to be out on the streets?
Every country is a little different. In Amsterdam, Jesuits were outlawed, but they were there anyway. So there's always this kind of practical toleration or practical intolerance that people still manage to find a way to look for converts. Some of the lesser religions, the minority religions, the radicals and so on, they didn't so much have missionaries as they had their communities that people were attracted to. They liked some of their ideas, or they knew somebody in the community or whatever. But you could go anywhere after the Reformation, and you could probably find someone willing to try to convert you to their religion. And that is a feature of the modern world, right? In the modern Western world, we understand it's possible to join a new religion, but that was not the case before the Reformation.
So any of you can answer that. Any particular Protestant sects, whether it be Lutherans or Calvinists or whatever, who were particularly invested in kind of the evangelical model from the outset, or?
The first great Protestant missionaries were really there were some from the beginning of the Reformation around 1520. The first great ones were around 1700, and a lot of them went to the New World. So there was missionary work within Europe, but in the sense of formal missionizing that Europeans came to understand is more what Cindy studies, where you go somewhere else. You went to Africa,
Okay, so
you went to the New World.
let me
the
actually,
Americas,
so
yeah.
let's use that to jump to Cindy's work, because you do really interesting work in particularly German women mainly, or men, both?
But primarily, that's how I started with the women.
So, what's your kind of early date of your research? Where do you pick it up, the thread?
Okay, so what you have to understand about me is that I'm not really looking at LDS missionaries at all. My research is about German missionaries that went all over the world. They went to China or India or Africa during the period when Germany had colonies. So that's sort of where I started. But the earliest texts, for example, I'm more interested in what they have the stories they have to tell rather than what they actually did or did not do. So you'll find that everything I say is sort of colored by that angle. But the first sort of memoir, for example, that I found by a German-speaking woman missionary was like 1848. And it wasn't women, for example, didn't enter the missionary force going abroad really until, well, in large numbers until about 1890.
Okay, so the German, where are the hot spots for Germans to go around the globe in the late 19th century?
India,
But
China.
British India, is there any tension there?
Oh,
or-
yeah, there's tensions. There's some
Okay.
tensions. But India, Africa was big, especially for German missionaries, because they had finally, Germany has a few colonies starting in about 1885, where they were really late to colonization. And so those are the big ones. And then also some in Samoa, Tonga, but mostly Africa, India, China.
Any to the Native Americans? Because when we
Yes,
think about the
there's a
Mormon
few.
tradition, right, isn't that essentially where it starts, is with the Native Americans? Or?
There's a few. I spend a lot of time reading what seems to me right now to be something like a really old-fashioned ensign. I read a lot of Protestant and Catholic sort of devotional literature and magazines, reporting on the missions, and you find a little bit of everything. And it's particularly fun when you're flipping through one of those and you see a picture of the tabernacle, and you're like, oh, what's this? And then you see, you read the Protestant views on Mormonism from, back from 1890 and 1900, and no, it's not very favorable, but it's interesting to read.
So let's fast forward then let's go to 1837 or kind of the Mormon moment at least. So Eric, a lot of your work has been on first missionaries, at least for the new book, First Missionaries in Italy. So when Lorenzo Snow and Fanny Stenhouse's husband, Mr. Stenhouse, and so forth, when they show up in Italy, 1850, is that right?
Yep.
Oh, are they the only missionaries there? Are there others there? What does it mean for these people to land on the shore and to be kind of spreading this new gospel?
So they're not the only people interested in sort of missionizing. There are British predecessors that have been there, kind of doing humanitarian work, but also sort of religious work as well. In Italy, one of the things that gets the Mormons to Italy is in 1848, as part of sort of a continent-wide revolutionary moment, the House of Savoy, the kings of Savoy, passed a new constitution, the Statuto, that basically recognizes, at least on paper, religious liberty. And that's one of the things that is attractive to Brigham Young and to the early missionaries, is this notion that there is kind of an opening in northwestern Italy, in Savoy, that they can maybe take advantage of. And they're familiar with this group of indeterminate sort of non-Catholic, semi-Protestant Waldensians that had fled actually in the 13th century from southern France to take refuge in the Alps in that region. And that's kind of the target. That's where they go. So it's a tiny minority, Protestant minority, in a massively Catholic majority country that the Mormon missionaries go to work with. And their assumption, and I think this is an assumption of most early Mormon missionaries, is that Catholics are not likely to be a fruitful sort of community for missionary work. And so they're not the elect. They're not the House of Israel. And so they go, the Mormon missionaries go, 3 or 4 of them is all, and work in these mountain valleys with Waldensian Protestants for about a decade and a half. And in the end, they get about 180 converts, half of whom go inactive or excommunicated, but the other half who immigrated.
So you're saying there's a very good retention rate.
Compared to today, absolutely.
So let's go to the more famous side of the 1830s and 40s. Let's go to industrial Britain, the north of England. And any of you can answer this. Craig, you might know a fair amount about this. So when Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball are out knocking doors in England, or going to services, are they running across anyone else who's doing what they're doing?
Oh, sure.
So who are they? Anyone from America?
That's a good question. I'm not sure about that. Matt might know that, actually. Certainly, there are all kinds of evangelical groups in that time. There are in Scandinavia as well. And I mean, they go to England, though, to bring up another issue related to this, because that's where they have a lot of family, a lot of relatives, which is the theme I hope we come back to. And the same thing happens in Scandinavia, with the result that a lot of the early converts in this period come from, especially England, and then it's like after 1850, 1860, then even more from Scandinavia. I've seen a statistic in Utah that some 60% of Mormons by around 1890 were from England or from Scandinavia. Thus, why I call it Anglo-Navian Mormonism, right? I mean, this is pretty much where we come from, and it has a lot to do with those family connections.
So, I mean, I've always assumed that there was something distinctly American about the appeal of the Mormon missionaries. I mean, these people coming from the New Zion, or the new promised land, if you will, who are bearing a restorationist, millenarian message. Less American context for this, or how important is the American element of this in any of the places you've studied?
For the Waldensians, it's really important because a lot of them are interested in migrating, and that's one of the selling points that the missionaries use is that they want everybody. At this point, of course, the church policy is to gather to Zion, and so they absolutely present sort of the possibility and the structure to facilitate immigration for converts. And they are aware that some of the people who do speak with them, the very few people who are interested and talk with them, are in part interested in the possibility of immigrating. The Waldensian valleys are extremely impoverished. They've been marginalized and isolated for centuries from the Catholic sort of lowlands. And so it's actually a pretty difficult period economically in Europe as well. So the economic promised land is attractive. There are more Waldensians who don't convert, who migrate to North Carolina, to California and other places, than do convert and come to Utah. Okay.
Cindy, do you have any sense from the stuff you read, that your German magazines, of what it would, of how a Viennese or a Berliner would approach to or for Mormon missionaries, Americans coming in their midst? I mean, any sense of how strange that would be, or?
I don't have any sense on that exactly.
Okay.
What I can say about what I can say about sort of the time frame that's interesting to me, which is just prior to World War I, is that generally in Europe at that time there's a huge surge of interest in missionary work. And during this time period, so like 1890, and in the next couple of decades, you see like missionary societies being founded at rates that are 30 times that of previous decades, so that everybody is somehow getting on the bandwagon of their faith, and everybody's either donating money or sending. They know somebody in the mission field. They're interested in other countries. They're reading about these other countries primarily, or quite often through the reports that come in from missionaries in those other countries. So there's a huge amount of enthusiasm at that time for missionary work. Still, I hardly imagine that enthusiasm would carry over to interest in missionaries that are showing up at their door saying, "Hi, I think that the Europeans would be like, well, why are you here? Because we're already Christians, we're already believers, and who are you?" Yeah.
Okay, so let's fast forward. I want to get to your moment in Europe as missionaries, but really quickly, so just general terms, Mormon missionaries get a bit of a foothold in 1850 to 52 in various parts of the continent. Really, is my read right that the polygamy announcement essentially kills Mormon missionary work in Europe for what, 50 years? Do you have longer?
There are still plenty of stories and rumors that come out of the period after that, especially in England, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in Britain. So I don't think it's killed for good, but certainly that's when a lot of the rumors start. And even to this day, right, if you talk to a European, the thing they've heard about Mormons is that they're polygamous. I mean, that's still, still has legs.
The Utah War is another thing, actually. The number of missionaries just diminishes in the mid-1850s because all the missionaries are called back. And for Italy, that's the decisive moment because the missionary numbers drop and conversions stop, and so
we have
that
this big,
slows things down.
the period of isolationism.
Retrenchment.
So my point of access to this is my father, who served a mission in the Netherlands, probably around 60, 61 or so. And his stories bear no resemblance to the stories of these poor souls who go and talk to people for 2 years and not a single one is interested. I mean, they were baptizing pretty regularly. Do you have any sense of this?
Yeah, again, it depends on the country. The Netherlands is an exceptionally open society to religions. It's a tolerant society in general. I've had some interviews there about books I've written, both in the Netherlands and in Dutch-speaking Belgium. And I do the interviews in both places. And the atmosphere in the interview is so different. In Belgium, I know I should not say that I'm Mormon or no one will keep listening to the interview. But in the Netherlands, it's like, oh, you're Mormon? How interesting, right? I mean, it doesn't mean they don't think you're weird, but it means, oh, that's interesting. There's one of them right here.
Okay, so let's get to your...
So it's an open society. The Netherlands is, and in fact, of the European countries, I mean, England tended to have the most, partly because of relations, partly because of language, right? I mean, language barrier is huge for most missionaries, right? When you don't know the language and you hear the missionaries coming back, you think they're geniuses. But when you actually learn the language, you realize how badly almost everyone is speaking the language. So I think that makes a big difference as well. But the Netherlands was one of those open societies.
And was that, so let's go, what year did you arrive in Brussels?
1975.
75.
I know I don't look it.
Okay, so 75, has anything changed on the ground between 61 and 75? I mean,
Yes.
secularism on the rise, or...
As far as European society?
Yeah, or in terms of,
Yeah.
what Mormon missionaries are meeting with.
To me, the 70s was the steroids era of Mormon missionaries, I mean, this is when it was hardcore, because in the 50s and 60s after the war, if you read the journals of missionaries from the 50s, I mean, it's just so fun to read because they're talking about going to the movies, and then they're going to a meeting, and then they're going to a play, and then they're, it's just this sense that they're integrated into the whole society.
My dad's stories, and then some girls from our hometown
There you
stopped
go.
in, and we hung out
There
for
you
a few
go.
weeks, and then we baptized 10 people, and
There
then...
you go. By the 70s, that didn't happen. And there were singing groups, there were the sports teams, right? They were famous. And because there were a few problems with that, it was decided, I think, in the late 60s, early 70s, just going to stop that. And it's going to be hardcore proselytizing. So it was 9:30 to 9:30 every day, and you memorized every word of the discussion because they didn't want anybody going rogue, teaching the doctrine and out of their own thoughts or something like that. So that's why it was so different, I think, from that earlier period.
And what did you find in Italy in 85 or so? Is that when you got there?
That's when I finished, yeah,
Okay.
83 to 85. I mean, Italy is a little bit different because there's that sort of first period of missionary work, very early on, one of the first continental missions to open. Then it closes in the 60s, 1860s, and doesn't reopen until 1965. And so there aren't missionaries. There's not really a presence for that period of time. So when they do reopen the mission, the growth is kind of slow for the first decade, maybe 1,000, 1,500 members or so by the early 70s. And then sort of the steroid era that Craig is describing actually is the most productive era in Italian LDS missionary work. And so there are thousands and thousands of members that kind of join in the 70s, and kind of the core of branches and of wards and sort of key leadership figures still to this day actually trace their roots back to the 70s. So, when I showed up in the early 80s, there was kind of this wistful sort of memory of this golden age, both on the part of the missionaries and the members, perhaps even more. And things were already starting to slow down. And there are a variety of factors, I think, both for the success of missionary work in the 70s, societal factors, things that are going on in European culture at the time, in Italy, and also factors within the Mormon community, attitudes towards how we do missionary work, things like that impact these numbers as well.
Yeah, it's not just how you do it. I mean, it has a lot to do with social dynamics that
Absolutely.
missionaries aren't even aware of. And so you could look at the 70s and you could say, oh, wow, that must have been because steroids worked, But
They were more
really,
faithful
there were other
missionaries,
things
right?
going on, or this is a classic thing when you talk to anybody who goes where there are, especially a lot of conversions, they tend to think it's because of their hard work and so on. Well, partly, but there are usually bigger social dynamics going on. When you're a missionary, you're not even aware of them.
What was the story in Vienna? 86?
88.
88?
I was in Vienna in 88. That was right after the Vienna mission had split into two. They took half the missionaries from the Vienna mission and put them into the East Bloc. Started that Vienna East mission, which is where we had sort of, I don't know, that was new. That was really a big development to have missionaries go into the East. Also, in my particular mission at that time, we had a really strange thing happen that is very common today, but was super unusual then. And that was that in my mission, of 80 missionaries in the mission, about 20 to 30 were women. At that time, we had the highest ratio of women to men in the mission field, in any mission in the church, in my mission. And I didn't realize at the time how unusual that was. That's more like normal today. But if it's okay, I kind of want to jump onto that topic of women in the mission field, because it's something we don't talk about. For years and years, women, missionaries were men. They were men, and it was supposed to be men. It was like a priesthood calling. And that was an idea among Protestants and Catholics as well. This is a man's assignment. This is not what women do. If women go into the mission field, they go as wives, as Protestant husbands, or they go to be nurses, or they go, to do some other, or teach in schools. But somewhere around the 1890s in Europe, they started to catch on to something that I think our church is also catching on to, which is the value of women in the mission field. Once you started sending women into the mission field in big numbers around that time period, at least the Protestants and the Catholics starting in 1890, when for the first time the number of women in the mission field for the Protestants and the Catholics started to exceed the number of men. And the reason this was so successful is because the men are out there trying to teach, in Africa, for example, the chiefs of, certain tribes or whatever. And they were, they'd convert those men and then that would be it. But if you had women missionaries and they were teaching the women and the women converted and then those women taught their children, then all of a sudden you have generational progress. And I think an interesting factor is something to look at, and I don't know much about, is this whole question of how has Europe missionary work changed as women have started to go more and more and more.
Yeah.
Have you, I mean, you traveled to Europe for your research and so forth. Have you, anecdotally, since 2012, any sense of how
Oh, there are more. I mean, the statistics are women are getting closer to 40%, 30 to 40%, I think. But for long, it was 10 to 20%, until this age change. But there's always, you often hear this fear expressed in Christianity, including in Mormonism sometimes, any time over the last 1,000 years that the religion is becoming feminized, that there are too many, we've got to get the men involved. Well, the story is, I can't think of a time in Christian history when there hasn't been more women than men, including in the New Testament. It's pretty clear that there are more women than men. So why not just go with it? Why not just accept that women are good at this and let them be involved and so on? And often, when I was a missionary especially, it's like, you got to convert men, right, so we can have leaders and so on. We probably should have been converting more women, because women usually outnumbered them anyway.
But what about I want to address something that's built into your statement, which is part of the old logic of the mission, and it's still an operative logic today, right? Is that we may send you to Finland, And there's a pretty good chance you're going to convert no one, but you're going to come away with two things. You will have converted yourself, and you'll have a language.
Maybe.
And so is
Questionable.
so is that the purpose of heavily sending men? Is the women don't need the converting as much? I mean, going.
I guess it's possible. I don't know if there's any explicit thought about that point, but maybe it's possible. You know, that we can't have the religion be feminized, so we have to have more men. I don't know.
That's probably in the first presidency's document.
Okay, so let's go back to that old truism, right? Language, and you save yourself, and you have two kind of great days off but miserable work weeks in Denmark. Any signs that this has changed? Post-communism in Europe, post-colonial Europe. What's the mission experience like in Vienna or Rome today, and how does that differ from what it was when you were there?
As far as converting people?
Yeah, it's converting, yeah.
I mean, I think one thing that is apparent to anybody who steps foot into a Mormon chapel, probably anywhere in Europe, certainly in Italy, is a great deal more diversity in the chapel than there was, in the early 80s. I taught entirely Italians the entire mission except for the last month, when I taught an African and I taught an Iranian. Today, in the last probably, beginning in the 90s, I would say, so in the last 25 years, with the increased sort of waves of migration from outside of Europe into Europe, but also internal European migration, a place like Italy has now, 4 million immigrants, half of them from within the European Union or within Europe more broadly defined, half from without. You have in Italy, lots of Central and South Americans. So missionaries work with immigrant populations, probably statistically have more success within those populations. Some of those immigrants are already members of the church, coming from Peru or wherever, who come and contribute leadership and experience and perspective that is probably lacking or is beneficial. There are all sorts of linguistic issues that arise from that. I think I haven't been to a meeting in the last 25 years that there's not a rumble of translation in the background as missionaries are translating to English or Spanish or whatever. So the actual numbers of conversions, I believe, for the most part in Italy, since these developments have increased compared to the 80s when missionaries were still primarily working with Italian populations. And so in that sense, there's been growth and perhaps leadership and positive developments in terms of rooting the church in Italy, which is where I know.
Yeah, I think it depends where you go, of course. It's going to vary from place to place. Northern Europe is famous for being slow to convert. Eastern Europe, in some places, I think better than others. But missions aren't just about converting people, as you've indicated. But if we want to talk about conversion, this is actually an area, where I've done a lot of research, and a lot of things came out of it. But the two things that were most interesting to me, from sociologists and so on, was first of all that the number one reason that you can measure why people convert. Ultimately, maybe you can never know. We know why someone converts. But the number one reason tends to be relationships. The promise of friends, family, and so on. And this was true in the Roman Empire. It's true in early modern Europe. It's true in the present as well. This helps to explain why, if you go on a European mission, you'll mostly speak with immigrants, because they don't have built-in relationships necessarily. They don't necessarily have a place in the social structure. And so they're looking for one. They're eager to talk to you. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong, with bringing in immigrants. But if you want to integrate into the wider society as well, then you have to establish more relationships. We used to be told on our mission, you're not here to make friends. And in retrospect, I think, actually, that's mostly what you should be there for, especially if you go on a mission to Europe. If you can convince people that you are not from another planet, you have done a great thing. And so making friends would maybe be the number one goal you should have if you go to a European mission. The second thing that came out of the research or that struck me in the research anyway, was that people mostly convert to something that's familiar. It's not completely different. And so what does that mean? It means that there'll be something that you add to what they already know, rather than it being so different. So if you go to a place and you think that Europe is, easy to understand until you get there and you realize it's a lot more different than you thought, maybe your religion will have something in common just coincidentally with what they think, but most often it doesn't. And so then it's up to you to make it familiar. And how do you do that? First of all, you have to understand their religion. We do a horrible job of that. I teach a course on the history of Christianity, and I've had a number of students say, I wish I would have known this before I went on a mission, right? I wish I understood what people believe just about Christianity, much less, Islam or some other religion where they might be working, Buddhism, whatever. So you have to understand their religion so that you can relate to it. And then the other thing is, how far can you accommodate their culture and their religion? And I'm sure Eric and Cindy will have things to say on this as well. But to me, this is the fundamental debate since the beginning, since the New Testament, with Peter and Paul basically laid down the two models that have existed ever since. And Peter has the big revelation, right, that we can let the Gentiles join our religion. And what he basically concludes is, yeah, you can join us as long as you're like us. And Paul, who's lived among Gentiles, he doesn't have any big revelation. He just knows if you're going to go among Gentiles, you can't do things the same way. You have to go their way. You have to accommodate them as far as you can. And so it makes you think really hard about what is essential in your religion. Paul decided that circumcision wasn't essential, and that was just heresy to most Jews. Circumcision would be like saying you don't have to be baptized, or you don't have to go to the temple, or whatever. I mean, this is how fundamental it was in giving identity. The dietary code, don't have to follow that, don't have to follow the Sabbath, you don't have to divorce your Gentile spouse. So when you go to another society then, the Peter model has prevailed in Mormonism. There are some accommodations, but are you willing when you go to Europe to do the Paul model and say, not drinking wine in the US is not that big of a deal, but not drinking wine in Europe, you are a freak. You are just so strange that people won't even associate with you. You won't even have a chance to integrate into society. And if you haven't been to European dinners, then maybe this only applies in the fine dining, areas. I don't want to.
Which is where you went on your mission.
I don't want to make fun of anyone's food. I mean, I love Scandinavia, but it's not the greatest food. But Belgium, France, Italy, Croatia are famous for their food, right? So this is the kind of thing. Can you give that up?
Well,
if you're a Mormon, can you say, that's not a crucial part of our religion? That's a really hard thing to say, because we're used to thinking about religion of the rhetoric of we stand up for what we believe in, instead of we're going to accommodate you. Well, but that is a tradition in Christianity as well.
Let me take that. Okay, so I'm going to put Cindy on the spot here. Okay, so based on Craig's findings then, how do you accommodate secular Vienna to a Mormon model? Where it's not so much a matter of converting them from some Christian religion as it's converting them to that there's a God who's involved in our lives, let alone that there's a God with an American prophet. I mean, that's a little too convenient, for a European mindset.
Yeah.
That was a tough mission. Maybe that sums it up. I was lucky enough to have 3 Austrians join the church that I taught. But I can tell you that I taught the 6th discussion all of 5 times in my entire mission, and all 5 of those got baptized. If I could ever get to the 6th discussion, ever, then usually that's
Why didn't you start with that one?
I don't know what I was thinking.
That's what we did in Virginia. It worked great.
I can tell you, it was a really tough mission, and it remains so today. And if you talk to missionaries in Austria today, really it is what you were saying. They are working with immigrants. They are working with immigrant population. And that may also explain something that kind of goes around in the circles of us language professors, right? Why don't missionaries that we have today come and speak the language as well as they did 10 years ago when we started teaching what has happened? And it may just be that they're primarily spending their time not with the Europeans, not with the secular.
Or
sort of-
with Europeans who speak better English than they speak Dutch, right?
That may also be a
Yeah.
factor. May also be a factor.
Yeah.
So Eric, okay, so we need to wrap this up, but I want to, so you're co-author on the History of the Church in Italy. Jim Toronto just got a really interesting mission call to the Central Eurasia Mission, opening up a mission in which it is former Soviet Stan countries, right? Turkey and the Stans, but all of them have in common, they're Muslim countries, but they have religious freedom. But Jim's mandate and the mandate of his missionaries is we are not, proselyting is second, service is first. We're making friends. Is that the model for parts of Europe, you think?
I think so in many ways. Going forward, I think in some ways that's maybe goes back to models that were successful that existed in the 60s and 70s. If you look at some of the data that Jim Toronto gathered researching the church in the 60s and the 70s in Italy, one of the common sort of refrains are the relationships that Craig was talking about before, is that members kind of look back almost wistfully on that time period when they knew the missionaries really well, and the missionaries were in the area for a long time, and there were kind of strong types of bonds that maybe eased that transition or that shift for them from a Catholic sort of a tradition into Mormon tradition. And so I don't know if that's because they were going to movies together and going to the beach or what, but you know, I think that there is certainly an element of that. It strikes me that more than when I was a missionary, at least, I have a son who just got back from a mission. Whether it happens or not, there certainly is more talk about service and sort of finding something meaningful to do for society, for the community that you're in, and not just doing the 9:30 to 9:30, you know, shanghaiing people on the road like we did, and knocking on doors and attacking people in the park and things like that, which, you know, once every 1,000 times produced results. But so I mean, I think that is going forward, but also looking backward, maybe in models.
That's a really interesting thing to think about, too, in the context of, at least, I don't know what all the European countries are like, but I was just thinking, in Germany, in Austria, it's really hard for missionaries to find service projects that they can do. They do service, but most of the time, if you went into, I don't know, a school or some other institution in those countries, and you said you want to volunteer, they would just look at you and say, well, we pay people to do that. Yeah. I mean, there isn't this, the culture doesn't really accommodate that kind of participation, volunteer participation in that.
But maybe in a moment when you have 1 point however many million new refugees in Germany or in Sweden, maybe there's an opening there to give genuine service. Times come in which you interrupt us and you join in the conversation. We've covered a lot of ground, some of it kind of generalized, some of it specific. We haven't talked at all about missionary work in Eastern Europe post-91. And we'd love to hear some of your experience, some of your questions, so the mic is yours to ask us questions based partly on your experience and other. We'll go for about 15 more minutes, and then we will all join together for refreshments. So please come to the mic if you have questions. This is being recorded for BYU Radio and for the Kennedy Center's web feed. So please introduce yourself and any pertinent information.
Hello, my name is Jacqueline. I'm Asian Studies major. I was just curious when you mentioned that they send missionaries to Africa and China. Like, could you explain more about that? Like, do you ever saw on your missions converts from those places?
In my particular mission, some of the converts, a lot of the converts in my mission were Filipinos, and then Africans. And I think today, the number of African converts in Europe are way, way high. I mean, I think they outstrip any other nationality in Europe in terms of people who are being converted now to Mormonism.
Interesting stat while the rest of you scramble for the microphone. I read two stories last week that seemed contradictory in British newspapers. One was from The Guardian, which said that Anglican church attendance on Sunday was at an all-time low. It was down to 760,000 people in the average week go to Anglican churches, which is 2% of the population. Same week, in The Economist, another British magazine, it pointed out that overall church attendance in the London area is up 16% in the last 10 years. And a lot of it is these waves of immigrants. And the Church of England is having to adjust to this with much more charismatic services and better music. And they always have better music than we did, but more lively music. So.
Hi, my name is Dennis Maservi, and I served a mission in south of France. My question is actually, as the Mormon religion, we propagate ourselves through missionary work as a Christian religion, and we've mentioned that immigrants are among the main people who listen to missionaries. I guess was kind of what was agreed upon, and I'm curious why, what your opinion is on the fact that in Preach My Gospel, the book that all the missionaries today study each day, it's specifically, it says it's dangerous to preach to Muslims because of the political environment of that. And I'm just curious why you think we still kind of sit in that, why Mormons still kind of sit in maybe this bubble of fear, is what I wonder if that's what it's motivates it, or a fear of maybe, why is it that Mormons don't preach towards Muslims with the same vigor that they might preach towards people of other Christian faiths, or of atheist background, or of any sort of religious background? I'm just curious if you want to talk to them.
That's a good question. I mean, it's a complex question. I wish Jim Turano were here, my co-author, because in addition to his work in Italy, he's lived in and has been an important sort of liaison with Islamic, Middle Eastern sorts of areas, part of the reason why he's living in Istanbul now as a mission president. I mean, there are complex sorts of policies that are in place that try to address this issue that in part probably are based on concern over those converts from Islam and what conversion to Mormonism what implications it may have for them, not in the context so much of Europe, if they have migrated and they're living there, but if they're going to go back to Tehran someday, or if they're going to be returning to Abu Dhabi or something. And so without getting into the details, which I don't know that specifically, there are very, very specific policies and lots of sorts of controls, I think primarily out of concern for maybe overcautiousness, I don't know, for converts who are not solidly sort of inserted into European or Christian sorts of contexts. But there are growing numbers of Muslims that are being converted in France. I'm sure you probably experienced working with Muslims there, but also in the United States and in other areas as well. So I think it's one of those areas that's evolving probably, and that we'll see some interesting developments in the future. It's a complex story still.
I would like to say something about that in sort of a practical sense. I have a very close friend whose father is Muslim, who joined the church in Germany in the 80s. And to this day, she is still very, very cautious. She lives in the United States. She attended BYU. She is far away from any of her possible relatives that exist in Muslim countries. But to this day, she is very cautious about who she gives her phone number to, about letting people know where she lives. She feels still to this day that her life could be in danger because of her conversion.
I too, is this on? Okay. I too had the opportunity to serve in France. As an oblique response to the last question, I personally experienced numerous, almost constant verbal assault in the parts of the Paris General area and Brussels areas that I served in, including a couple physical altercations, which I did not start. Nor participate in out of self-preservation.
basically just kind of had to take it. But my question, which is somewhat related to that, is a demographer might point out that birth rate amongst Western Europeans is rather low. Also, the influx of migrants would lead one to presume that Islam is going to be an ever more present demographic in Western Europe. Also, the steep increase in secularization. Are we going to allocate the same amount of resources to doing missionary work in Western Europe that we have traditionally, or are we going to move them somewhere perhaps more productive in terms of numbers?
Well, the missions have continued to be split, right? I mean, I was in the Belgian Antwerp mission, which lasted 7 years, and it was then joined with the Netherlands mission, and then it was then joined with, even bigger. So I think the number of missions is supposedly the same as it was in the 70s, except that in the 70s we weren't in Eastern Europe and Russia. And so, yeah, the total number of missions is the same, but they keep getting bigger and bigger. So I think the answer is already there, that not as many resources are being allocated as there were before. It's mostly going to Latin America and so on. But that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to give up in Europe.
Good question, caller. Just quickly, another plug for Craig's book. If you've read Craig's book, you'll wonder that the mission lasted 7 years rather than just 2, with him on the ground there in Antwerp. So.
I'm Holly Bowd. I served in St. Petersburg, Russia, and I did just briefly want to bring up communism and sort of missionary work post-communist, communism in Eastern Europe, and what, in your experience, what you know, how is it necessary to approach missionary work, after the fall of communism versus how it was approached before, and with state religions and things, kind of how has missionary work been affected, how to allocate certain, cultural practices and things? Just wanted to speak on that.
Do you have any sense from Eastern Germany at all? Or?
I don't know.
There weren't missionaries there, so it's hard to say what's before and after. But I think it's partly up to missionaries and to the people training the missionaries to learn the religion. And if the religion is communism, you need to learn, what people believed, it seems to me. That's how you go about approaching it, I think.
I can't speak to former Eastern Bloc countries, but I can say in the Italian context, Italy had one of the largest communist parties in Western Europe, and Mormon missionaries actually had a lot of success with communists in Italy. They're the red heart of Italy, in a region, Bologna, Modena, sort of central Italy, was very famous for the power, the strength of the Communist Party. Was also an area in which Mormons had fairly good success and converted members of the Communist Party who remained communists, which created some tensions when church leaders were sort of fulminating against communism in the 60s before they stopped in the 70s.
So maybe we could get
So there were some, and for some of those converts, they actually saw some parallels to some of the aspirations or the vision that they had of society growing out of their communist sensibilities, that they saw paralleled in certain LDS doctrines and practices, which they found attractive in Mormonism, and led to their conversion. There was no tension between being a communist and being a Christian in Italy that may be different from areas in which communism was more deeply rooted and had a longer tradition. But plenty of communist branch presidents and stake presidents and others in Italy in the 70s and 80s.
According to Tom Alexander, a Mormon historian, there were quite a few immigrants from Europe who belonged to the Socialist Party, or who were socialists who immigrated to Utah, and they were converts as well. So in the old days, it didn't necessarily have to be a contradiction. So
maybe rewrite the first discussion for post-communist countries to make an emphasis on the United Order and so forth. 3 quick questions. We'll do a kind of a lightning round finish here.
Okay. My name's Tegan Pitcher, and I just recently returned from a mission in Denmark, the Copenhagen, Denmark mission. And Denmark was or Danish was the second language that the Book of Mormon was translated into, and the influence of the church was so big in Denmark in the early church days that 80,000 saints actually migrated from Denmark to the U.S. But what do you think the effects would be if those saints had just decided to stay there? What would the missionary effects have been if those saints had just decided to stay there and the church?
There were big evangelical movements in Scandinavia in general in the 19th century, and not all those who converted to Mormonism necessarily did migrate. I think in Sweden, what was the figure I read? I think there were 30,000 converts from 1860 to 90, and I think 6,000 of them stayed there, and half of them just stopped going, and then the rest emigrated. So there probably was a fair number who did stay. But yeah, had those 80,000 stayed, maybe it would have made a difference, but maybe they emigrated also for other reasons, right? Yeah, in Sweden, it was for a lot of economic reasons. The way the land was divided, there's no industrial revolution yet, and so it was harder and harder to make any kind of living, so there were lots of reasons to emigrate. So yeah, it's a hard what if.
If they'd stayed in Italy, they would have gone inactive. That says nothing about Italy, but historically that's what happened. There's no infrastructure in the 19th century to support people staying in their country. They're primarily being converted to immigrate. And when everybody who's immigrated, those that stay behind live in isolation.
Yeah.
The church itself, I mean, this is a long, there would be a lot to say about this, but the Mormon church itself sort of has these hit and run tactics for lots of Europe, in and out, in and out. And so there's no continuity in terms of missionary presence or leadership or infrastructure, and the missions start and stop, in France, half a dozen times, for example. And so it's an interesting question, but I think it might have turned out quite similarly to how it ended up turning.
Great.
Good question. Two last questions, Lydia.
I'm Lydia Bexa in Japan, Fukuoka. And I noticed in my mission we try to accommodate the local cultures in Japan. I was wondering if you guys noticed that in Europe as well. You mentioned the two different ways of conversion or preaching, spreading the gospel.
I don't have an answer on this one.
Well, there's always some accommodation. You know, like the Peter and Paul models that I held up, they're just ways to think about it. But even if you follow the Peter model mostly, there's always some small accommodation. The question is, how much are you willing to accommodate? What do you really think is essential in your religion? And it's hard to see going beyond. I mean, in practice, there are always, you always hear stories. There are always some crazy things that happen, and somebody did this and somebody did that. But officially, the accommodation tends to happen in small ways, in ways that are just not seen as really significant. But that's why I want to highlight Paul. I don't think we thought about the significance of this. I mean, he's giving up things that are fundamental to their identity. And Paul was not loved for this. I mean, the whole book of Revelations is a diatribe against Paul's disciples for corrupting pure religion. It's not just predicting the end of the world. It's predicting the end of the Roman Empire because of Paul's disciples ruining true religion. So this is a big argument, is my point. And I don't know how. I can't think of any big ways we tried to accommodate local culture.
I think basically that we don't do that very well at all. And I think that one thing that stays very clearly in my mind from my time in the mission field was the way in which local members experienced a certain degree of frustration with the missionaries coming over from the United States who think they know everything and decide to tell them how to run the church. And that was always a real sore spot.
Well, even my friends who listen to missionaries in Europe, they'll tell me, they are not interested in what I have to say. They just want to say what they have to say. And that itself is a form of accommodation. Just listening to what somebody has to say, that's something you can do even with the Peter model. You can say, all right, I want to hear you. I want to understand where you're coming from. But we're often not patient enough with that. It's like if they're not interested in progressing, well, then you got to move on. That's how it was in the 70s. You got to move on, don't make friends, whatever. And so that's a kind of social accommodation rather than cultural accommodation. Even that we weren't necessarily willing to make.
Let's, you know what we're going to do? We're going to close with the cafe owner, Wade Jacoby, coming to tell us it's closing time, but asking one question before he turns on the lights.
It'll be too big. It'll be a huge question.
Well, but all these talk radio shows say, I'll take my answer offline, which means they'll go listen to, and we can talk about this in the reception. But let me ask Cindy directly, but I'm sure everybody has comments on this. At BYU, we have a kind of unique experiment we've been running for a long time, where we take mostly American undergraduates who have an extraordinary degree of linguistic ability in one very narrow slice of a foreign language. And when they come back to campus, we try to broaden that. We try to mix it with culture and history and a lot of other disciplines. And we could talk for a long time about how well we're doing. But the question is, Cindy, what have you learned in being in a language department as you are? What's the key for you to move somebody from a mission level of fluency to a professional level of fluency, which almost no American undergraduates in any language are able to achieve, but some of our students are able to and a whole lot aren't?
I think it's a couple of things. A lot of missionaries come back from their mission having absolutely no clue really about the culture of the place they've been. They get a little bit of a taste where they think they know something, but we try to dump them right away into a cultural history class where they're finally like, oh, it's like a revelation to them, some of the things that they didn't know about their own culture, about the culture where they'd been serving. I think that's a big factor because once they understand, I almost wish we could do this before we sent them out. Because once they understand that culture, then they develop a new passion and love for it that they didn't really have before. And once they get that, you can send them back. We send them, the ones that go back to Europe, that go study there, that then really do have that opportunity to accommodate that other culture in ways that they can't on their mission because it's against the rules to go to the movies with them or to go to the opera or to go, whatever they do there. Those are the ones that I see coming back that eventually, by the time they graduate, have this sort of a linguistic ability as well, because they have that passion for the culture as a whole.
That's fantastic. Let's end there. Again, thank you to everyone who made this happen. Thanks to Kelly Blazian, who's out there. Nellie Ashby provided the refreshments. Many others have been involved. Lee Simons did the promotional material. Let's give a big hand for the three. And please join us for refreshments in the foyer.
Nice job.